All right. Well, guys, I'm so happy to see all of you here. And my presentation is actually going to focus in on how to live a happier life covering impactful stories. And I'm so excited that we're having this discussion today because I think it's so important that we do on so many different levels. And especially as a person who values well-being, you're going to find a little bit more about me in a moment, but then also the lens and my why and the value of the research that I'm a part of that can really serve you in terms of crafting a happier life. And then there's also what Dr. Vincent says is about really being intentional. And so this presentation is all about you being proactive and intentional as relates to your well-being. So this is actually a quote or statement, so to speak, that came from RTDNA, the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. Of course, you guys know. And I also write for RTDNA. And one of the things I was really proud of seeing was this information that was originally shared by the United Nations, but then also talks about it's okay not to be okay. And I was really drawn to this because as Dr. Vincent talked about so many of the different elements that you can go through in terms of coping and resilience, and then some of the emotions that you may feel. What I value about it is that we really are beginning to have these discussions of the importance of talking about this, and particularly in news, where for years I believe silence was something that was just understood, but now I'm happy to hear that we're making some noise, especially on a management standpoint with RTDNA and particularly about looking at well-being, valuing well-being, and work-life balance. So I was very happy to see this, but I will tell you this, by this image, I wasn't very okay when I looked at this image. So this is actually an image from my fiance's live hit. So my fiance is a reporter in the Charlotte market, and I screen grabbed this when he was live. And so the image is a little faint, but I think you can kind of make out what's going on, right? And so what's happening is that he's live, this is going on right behind him. A protester actually went and threw a brick at a window. They weren't successful. They crossed the street, and they were met by a group of individuals that actually was holding the protester down by someone saying, "This is not what we're here for." Right? And so they were disappointed, to say the least, that the protester was trying to throw the brick and holding that protester for police. But as a person that is engaged to a journalist, I was sitting here thinking to myself about the well-being of Ken, the well-being of my fiance. And that night was, a very hectic night for him in terms of reporting, working double duty that day. He dealt with a possible brick being thrown at him. So he was dealing with so many different dynamics, but I thought this image said it all. And at that moment, I wasn't okay, even though I will tell you this in terms of my why is having a deeper understanding of my fiance's work, because I'm a former television reporter and news director turned happiness scholar. And so one of the reasons why I think it's important to say that is because it's also the lens that I use in regards to the research that I do in my area, which happens to be positive psychology, which you're going to learn about in a moment. And because of what I was seeing in the industry and in terms of reporting, and especially when I was a news director, in terms of really trying to think about the well-being of my team, I began to focus in on studies within my PhD at the University of Florida. And I will tell you this, that I'm no stranger of going through covering impactful stories or even having an impact in terms of my own life, because when I was early on in my reporting career, I became a widow at 25 years old when I was reporting in Philadelphia. And so that also was, impactful in terms of my life because of not only dealing with that personally, but then dealing with the fact that at the time my late husband's death made news. So I've seen it on so many different levels, and it was so important for me to focus in on the well-being of our industry, because I think it's important that we have these conversations. So I'm pretty excited that we're going to have this conversation today. So let's talk about positive psychology, and I get pretty excited talking about it. So positive psychology, the image says a lot as it relates to positive psychology because it's a scientific study of strengths and optimal human functioning that enables individuals and communities to thrive. So for some time, the founders of positive psychology had decided we had focused so much on what's wrong with us. Positive psychology was finding out what is right with us and how individuals thrive. So the movement is about sharing science with a mass audience that can really help them have more meaningful and fulfilling lives. And so it really comes down to how we flourish is one of the terms we use a lot in my research, because it's looking at how do you go about kind of flourishing or bouncing back, as Dr. Vincent was talking about resilience, right? And the importance of resilience. Resilience is all about how do we bounce back, how are we coping, and how are we dealing. And what I love about this work is giving us evidence-based strategies that can serve us to help us flourish. So you may say to yourself at this point, well, how can I live a happier life as a journalist? And one of the things I know you've heard a lot about and is trending is self-care, right? Everyone is talking about the value and the impact of self-care. And we're going to talk about self-care. But what I want you to do is I want you to be very intentional and have a proactive approach as it relates to thinking about your overall well-being. And in that case, I want you to think about kind of powering down. I don't want you powering down and shutting down anything right now during this webinar, right? But I want you to think about during moments of self-care is pausing. What can I do right now? I need to pause, I need to slow down, and I want you to be proactive when you do that. And one thing in terms of being proactive is really thinking about your strategy. And so well-being at work serves us. It serves us on an individual and an organizational level. A workplace strategy can really help the performance of an organization. It can lead to reduced levels of illness on the job. It can also build trust and, of course, employee loyalty. So there's various benefits for companies and particularly to focus in on well-being, but it's also important individually. So tip number one as relates to building and understanding your self-care is create a well-being strategy. This is you being intentional in regards to what it looks like in regards to your roadmap and plan concerning really your well-being. So again, a well-being strategy promotes health, well-being. Mentioned earlier, it does this individually and as relates to an organization, but it also helps build resilience in your life, right? Because you're being intentional, you're taking some proactive strategies. It's also clear as it relates to objectives, activities, and positive interventions. So part of this presentation today will focus on giving you some positive interventions to focus and to really kind of build and develop the constructs of your well-being strategy. So first, I have to say this in regards to your strategy is really thinking about this on a couple of different levels. One of which is really valuing tip number two, which is positive emotions. So research supports that positive emotions are integral to our well-being. Of course, right? We're thinking about happiness or joy, positive emotions in terms of the dynamic of maybe an event that we are going to, being a celebratory event, or something that has brought us joy in terms of a meaningful event with family and friends. One of the things I want you to keep in mind in terms of thinking about elements that bring positive emotions is really looking at how it's going to serve you individually, right? So it's literally a social experiment in understanding what your needs are and then understanding how you're going to take a proactive approach and what works for you. So I'm going to give you some ideas to hopefully inspire you to kind of begin your own social experiment, but also think deep as it relates to what are some of the things that really serve me in terms of increasing my positive emotions? One of the things I would say is maybe plan a day for yourself. Of course, when we hear about self-care, we think about having a spa day, which is a great thing to do, right? To kind of focus in levels on self. Maybe a picnic. Might be a picnic with friends, or you might decide you want to have a solo picnic and dealing with the stillness of yourself in that moment. And then also thinking about what those hobbies are. You know, what is something that kind of brings you joy and that you really value? I wrote an article some time ago about well-being in terms of how to incorporate a well-being strategy within a natural disaster in newsrooms. And one of the things I mentioned was yoga, right? Yoga, meditation, being mindful, thinking about what can also help you develop even more positive emotions. But what's so important is this, and I hope you remember this, is that be intentional, schedule it, considering it a meeting for self. Right? This is taking a proactive approach in terms of understanding the value and the importance of self-care. And we can increase our positive emotions by really how we think in terms of our past, our present, and even our future. And this actually goes to the benefits of gratitude. So being grateful can teach you the value of kind of looking back on a past event, maybe even looking in terms of a present event, right? But it's being grateful as it relates to what's going on in your life, in terms of really looking at the good and looking at the outcomes of where that came from. So research supports this, and one of the things in terms of science is they looked at healthcare workers who were keeping a gratitude diary for about 2 weeks, and it actually reduced perceived stress by 28%. Another thing that it did, it also had a reduction in depression by 16%, and that was writing in a gratitude diary. Also, gratitude has its overall benefit in terms of reducing levels of stress. Of course, we heard a lot about cortisol, right? And that is by 23%. But what's so interesting is that practicing it can also serve you in terms of helping improve your sleep quality. Dr. Vincent talked about elements of sleep, right? It's understanding the value of that in terms of, instead of maybe at night when you're thinking about shutting down, that instead of letting your mind wander, you might let your mind think about what you're grateful for. I always tell people it's great to do at the end of the night. It's actually what I do at the end of the night in terms of kind of counting your blessings, right? So it really helps you in terms of understanding the dynamics of what you're grateful for. So one of the things I highly recommend, because I talked about a diary and making some generalizations, but one of the things I do recommend is using a jar. I love it because it allows for a visual component. And it's interesting when I have coached individuals as it relates to leveraging using a gratitude jar, they really enjoy it because they take this and they decide that they're going to make this jar their own. Which you can. This jar that's in the picture is actually a jar that I have in my home that I utilize. A friend of mine who is a former anchor, she loves utilizing her jar in regards to a family activity. So it could be an individual or family activity. But what's so great about it is thinking about what you're grateful for, being in that present moment. And then, as I mentioned, it's great in terms of a shutdown ritual. It literally tells my brain at night when it's time, when I'm thinking about maybe the 3 or even 5 things that I'm grateful for. Okay, I'm turning in. I'm heading to bed. So this activity can be powerful on that level. It can also be powerful on another one too. When my fiance and I were long distance, he would create gratitude jars for me. So he would write about all the things he was grateful for in our relationship. And so it was increasing his levels as it relates to positive emotions by thinking about what he was grateful for in our relationship. And then every time I read it, it was increasing positive emotions for me. So this is an interesting dynamic in terms of really valuing gratitude. And I will tell you this, when I was reporting, I was pretty grateful for some moments where I would cover some hard-hitting stories and looking back on what I was grateful for at that moment, especially during a time when I was going through so much tough times in regards to being a widow. So it's really a great activity on so many different levels. So remember this in terms of the benefits of gratitude and really the science of it all. Another great tip is tip number 3, which is positive relationships. And I always like to qualify relationships, not simply relationships in terms of a generality, but really focusing on the impact and the importance of positive relationships. And relationships are really central to our well-being. The time we spend in relationships can bring us joy, laughter, again, positive emotions, belonging, meaning, and accomplishment, which is really, I see it as such a great kind of double impact, so to speak. APA talks about the value of good connections, but what's so wonderful is that in terms of building your well-being strategy is valuing both meaning, the meaning in terms of the connection with friends, and also the level of accomplishment as well. So there's so many benefits in terms of the value of positive relationships. So a positive intervention is, I like to call it, we all have the hashtag, this relationship goals, and we talk about the value of those goals. Well, I will tell you this, I really believe in the impact and the value of self-care squad goals. All right, so keep that in mind, self-care squad goals. And so research suggests that accepting help and support by those who care for you will strengthen your resilience, right? So important in terms of how we bounce back. And you can find that in organizations, from your professional organizations. I've been a proud member of NABJ for over 20 years, and it's been great seeing a level of community within our organization, as well as other organizations that I'm a part of. You can find that with also faith-based organizations, but also your newsroom. One of the things that I treasure about news is the level of family I always felt working in a newsroom, and how I leaned on many of my co-workers and how we leaned on each other. Then also clearly family and friends. But this is where the qualifier comes in, right? Because I just didn't say any relationship, I said positive relationships. Is understanding who these individuals are, identify them, and then search for people who are empathetic, who value perspective taking, who are good active listeners. It really is someone that really truly understands the thoughtfulness in regards to how they may share information, right? So there's so much value in regards to thinking about, again, those self-care squad goals. And I will say this, another great example is I have a couple of friends, we do this tech support. And so we have an understanding. That's the interesting part about when you identify individuals. It's the fact that you've discussed this, hey, I think it'd be great if we're there for each other as it relates to, it's usually implied in a friendship, but I always think it's great when you discuss it. And so we've discussed these ground rules of, hey, we do this text support. There's no judgment. If you want to send a text at 3 a.m. just to talk, to get something off your chest, that's fine. And it's always understood that someone's going to reply, and that in that whole correspondence between us, it's so much empathy and really just no judgment. So it's about thinking about and being mindful of those relationships. Tip 4 is self-compassion. And the science of self-compassion is really impactful because it's really thinking about self-kindness, right? When we think about compassion, we may think about how we're focusing on someone else's suffering. Well, self-compassion is inward. Is focusing on treating yourself the same way you would treat another person suffering. And I think that's very important, especially when you're in a world fast-paced like news and you're covering different stories, and you may say, gosh, I could have covered this story better, right? It's thinking about your self-talk. So when you're having a difficult time, you may deal with maybe levels of failure, or you may notice a difference in yourself. You need to stop and say, and it's the value of self-compassion is, how can I comfort and care for myself at this time? What do I need right now that's going to serve me? It really gives you a moment to think about and reflect on what you need and addressing those needs, which are so important and impactful. So the positive intervention I want you to think about is from one of the leading scholars in self-compassion, named is Dr. Christian Neff. And she has an activity called How Would You Treat a Friend? And one of the things to kind of briefly walk you through it, she has you really think and write your responses out, but really kind of thinking through what that interaction looks like. Think about the times when a close friend feels bad or is struggling, and then how would you respond to that friend? But then another question is, how about when you feel bad about yourself? And these are very important questions because sometimes we may find ourselves harder on ourselves. And so what this does, it allows you to understand how would you respond, and responding with the same love, compassion, and empathy that you would do someone else, that you're going to now do for yourself. This is a really important exercise. And again, Dr. Christian Neff is phenomenal in regards to her work in this area. So I'm going to give you guys a bonus tip. And this is something that is important, especially if there's managers on this call. But then also, this is something that I think it needs to be a continued discussion in our industry in general. And that is really how important compassionate news leaders and how they can help. And so I just recently wrote an article for RTDNA focusing on the value of compassion in newsrooms. And I got a message from journalists, and one in particular told me, I really like what you're sharing here, Kortni, in regards to talking about this. I hope it spreads. Because it's so important that it spreads. I think today on this call, we can really work on spreading this message, because it's important, because it's not simply a great headline. Science supports compassionate operations and compassionate companies. And when a company does practice this, they are contributing to psychological safety with their employees. It actually increases creative ideas and innovation, which is something really important in our field. It focuses on employee wellness, and it's good for recruitment and retention, because if a person is treated well, then of course they're going to want to continue to stay. But what's also very important is how empowering it is for an individual who's working in an organization like that, and then also focusing on the construction of their well-being strategy, because that manager has a well-being strategy for the team, and now you are a part of that, and then on top of the fact that you have one for yourself as well. So important. And I hope you take a look at that article, and I hope we can spread the word together. So last but not least, my tip is tip number 5, and it is ask yourself, do I need professional help? So when I worked on the article and started researching how to implement a well-being strategy in newsrooms, I talked to a clinical therapist who actually used to be a news producer. And so she recommended this. So when you begin to really not feel yourself, or you're shying away from stories, shying away from events in the newsroom, she highly recommends seeking professional help, especially if it's continually replaying, if you're ruminating about this. And of course, we've talked about this in the news, but we've also talked about this in a general sense, but how some may view mental health. And in the terms of mental health treatment serving as a stigma, but this can hinder really getting the help that you need. Taking care of yourself is the most important thing you can do. When I personally talk about this, I think it's important that people hear this from me, because I'm a happiness scholar, and also because of the fact that I'm African-American female, and I speak a lot about the value of therapy. When I was working as a journalist in Philadelphia and I returned back from bereavement leave, my first story I covered was a funeral assigned by my news director. And I think I was able to handle it as well. I was able to handle under the circumstances because of the help that I received in terms of therapy. So remember, the most important job you have is a job you have to take care of yourself. And so I want you to also remember that self-care isn't selfish. Remember that you can't serve from an empty cup. My mentors always remind me, you serve from your saucer, not your cup. That's why it's important to be proactive, to always fill it. And I hope you consider this presentation really your permission slip to be human, to do just that, but also now to have some proactive strategies to really help you develop your self-care needs. And so I'm going to end it with this quote of the day, really a quote to live by. And this is Dr. Christian Neff, which I've talked about in this presentation. She says, unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks, what's good for you? And I think it's important to say that across the board is being really in touch with what you need and thinking about some evidence-based strategies and doing your own social experiment to find out what's really going to serve you. It's important that you schedule it just like you schedule any meeting that you may have in the newsroom. So guys, I would love for us to keep in touch. This is my contact information. Feel free, you can follow me on my Facebook page, which is Dr. Kortni Alston. I'm on Instagram, I should say, as the Happy Researcher, Twitter at Dr. Kortni Alston, and you can always visit my website where I have a lot of different resources, and particularly pertaining to positive psychology. And so I'm going to end it with this note. I'm pretty grateful for our time together. I'm looking forward to find out what's going to serve you in regards to covering these tough stories.